Hello!
The Nintendo 64, the fun machine. The last Nintendo console to use cartridges until 2017, and the system where every other game had 64 in its title. Ahoy there! As much as I love the N64, one thing has always bothered me. What's with all the 64 games? It seemed like most of the console's library had games using the 64 suffix. So why 64? Well, simply put, the Nintendo 64 is a 64-bit console. Duh. Bits have lost their meaning in recent years, especially in the console space. But in the 1990s, the console wars were still a thing, so games on the N64 carried the number 64 in their title to denote that A, it was a game for a 64-bit system, and B, it was exclusive to the Nintendo 64. It does not mean that it's the 64th installment of a franchise, because games haven't even gotten close to those numbers in the 90s. Not even Final Fantasy, who skipped out on the N64. But going back to the console wars thing, it seemed like Nintendo borrowed a page from the Atari Jaguar in that 64-bit games were better than 32-bit games on the PlayStation or Saturn. Look where that got Nintendo. Nowadays, we look at games with 64 in their name as games that originated on the N64. Even with the 64 suffix, it's still confusing. In an attempt to clean up the messy nature of N64 64 games, I've categorized them into two groups. 1. Completely original games, and 2. Ports of existing games. Good examples of original games with the 64 suffix are the two N64 launch titles in North America, Super Mario 64 and Pilotwings 64. Super Mario 64 needs no introduction. It was the 3D platformer that basically invented the 3D platformer. Pilotwings 64 was an evolution of the Super Nintendo game in which it had actual 3D graphics instead of the pseudo-3D flat planes of Mode 7. I can tell you what's not a good example of an original 64 game. Doom 64. Despite carrying the Doom name, this version of Doom was a completely new game built from the ground up by Midway San Diego. Contemporary reviews of the time felt that it was just more Doom. I can 100% tell you that it was just not another Doom port, because it featured none of the levels or music from the original PC game. It was a standalone game that developed a cult following over the years, and ended up becoming canon to the 2016 reboot. And why not segue to another boomer shooter to talk about ports of existing games? Duke Nukem 64 is just a port of Duke Nukem 3D, but partially censored thanks to Nintendo policy. Gex 64 Enter the Gecko is the N64 version of Gex 2 on the PlayStation, and Mega Man 64 is literally Mega Man Legends from the PlayStation. But what about those games passed from EA and Psygnosis over to THQ? I'm referring to Road Rash 64, Nuclear Strike 64, and Destruction Derby 64, which were all published by THQ under license from the aforementioned EA and Psygnosis. Road Rash 64 started life as the N64 version of Road Rash 3D on PlayStation, but it was turned into its own thing with a higher emphasis on combat. The game's PlayStation roots are evidenced by the soundtrack, which used similar music from Sugar Ray, CIV, and Full on the Mouth. Otherwise, Road Rash 64 is its own thing. Same deal with Destruction Derby 64. This is not a port of any prior Destruction Derby game, but it also didn't start life as a PS1 game. Nuclear Strike 64, on the other hand, is a port of the PS1 game, and was actually made by the same developer who worked on Road Rash 64. There are about 43 games in the North American N64 library with 64 in the title, or more like 42 and a third. I dare not cover them all in this video because I don't have the mental capacity to try something like my N64 racing game video again. For now, at least. Instead, here's a lightning round of me sorting new games and ports. Robotron 64 is new. Mario Kart 64 is new. Micro Machines 64 Turbo is a port. Monster Truck Madness 64 is a port. Madden Football 64 is new. Carmageddon 64 is ass. Ogre Battle 64 is new. And Virtual Pool 64 is a port, I guess? I don't know, it's not clear. I hope that helps clarify things, because the deeper we dig, the more confusing the naming of games gets. For instance, This is Castlevania. It's an N64 game just called Castlevania. This is not the original Castlevania, nor is it a 3D remake of the first game. It's its own damn thing. So why isn't this called Castlevania 64? We now have to apply this moniker to the game to distinguish it from the NES game. We move from flawed to awful with Superman, the worst game to ever, and a contender for the worst game ever to exist. Its subtitle is actually The New Superman Adventures, but nowhere on the box or cartridge does it say that. Not even the title screen says it. It just says Superman.
Then there's no time to waste.
While most gamers would logically refer to this game as Superman 64, I think that's incorrect. It should be referred to as dog shit. Now, if you thought Doom 64 was confusing, then you haven't seen Quake 2 on the system. The N64 version of Quake 2 has entirely new levels. It looks like Quake 2, but it's an original take on Quake 2. It doesn't have the thumping metal soundtrack from Sonic Mayhem, sadly, but it does have an eerie ambient soundtrack from Aubrey Hodges. He also produced the ambience for Doom 64. So, does this mean this version should have been called Quake 2 64? Maybe, but that looks kinda wrong. Now, I forgot to save the original voice recording for this part, but I just wanted to say the 64 suffix has aged poorly. But nothing grinds my gears more like ports of old games being sold as a new N64 game. So here's a bunch of N64 games not worthy of the 64 moniker. A simple number can have a huge impact on a product. The number 64 could either mark a game of quality in the emerging 3D space, or it could be a port of an older game with real polygons, or it could be a reminder of the growing pains of 3D games. I personally think that game publishers went overboard with the use of 64 during the N64's life, since it raised more questions than answers. Then there were a few games that honestly should have used the 64 suffix. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this quick little dive into one of the most confusing naming schemes in all of gaming. What are your thoughts on games with 64 in their name? Which 64 game is your favorite or least favorite? And why is it not Super Mario 64? Leave a comment below. Until next time, I leave you with some food for thought. Try replacing every 64 with Ultra, and let me know if that sounds better or worse. Squiddy the Kid signing off. Like, comment, subscribe, and all that jazz. I have no idea why I did it like that, I'm sorry.